Hi, good morning, and welcome to the last part of cryptography, at least the last part for the InfoSec course. So today we want to talk about protocols and applications. So we want to have a look at how to fit all the things and the ingredients we've seen so far together. So if you've forgotten what we've done so far, let's have a quick look at that. So first at what the previous lectures were about. So we had 3 pure crypto lectures so far, talking about 2 different security goals, integrity and confidentiality, and how to achieve those with symmetric cryptography, where both participants have the same key. And finally, last week, we had a look at asymmetric cryptography. So at ingredients, how to establish communication so that afterwards we can use symmetric crypto. And for this, to get the conversation kick-started, we need something like key exchange or an asymmetric encryption scheme. And additionally, we had a look at signatures, which are an asymmetric way of achieving authentication and integrity. So what's the plan for today? I already said protocols and applications, and I think you could also call this lecture Theory Meets Applications. So this means we're trying to have a look at how these ingredients fit into real-world scenarios. I've picked out a few examples. We're going to have a look at one protocol in a bit more detail, and then have a brief discussion about some other protocols and what they do different, what separate challenges they faced, and so on. And I also have prepared a bit of a jumble of other topics, so some small snippets from very different areas. Today is going to be a bit colorful, so to say. And here we want to discuss, for example, what issues we have when we put cryptography in practice, so what common failures, for example, are. We're going to discuss a few additional threats that we haven't discussed so far. For example, I'm briefly going to have a look at quantum computing. I'm going to have a look at a few privacy scenarios that are interesting, relevant for these two. So that's about the outline. So several of the topics today are based on some of the questions you've asked in the previous lectures, so some of the material is new. And I would also say that the topics today are very much varying in how essential they are, in my opinion, for you to remember. So there are a few really important things like the basic principles of protocols, or also knowing the basic failures that can happen when you apply cryptography. Those are really, really important things that you should remember. But there are also a few selected topics where I want you to have heard about them once, but it's not like you need to remember the stuff till the end of your days. So I'm trying to make it a bit clearer which belongs in which category in the following. Let's first have a look at the recap of last week, and afterwards I can get to those questions we have already. So what did we talk about last week? I already said asymmetric cryptography. And we said that these asymmetric primitives are usually based on hard problems. So complexity theoretically hard problem. And one of these hard problems that we talked about is the discrete logarithm problem. If you remember, for these discrete logarithm problems, we always talked about having a group where specifically we looked at the group that we get if we look at multiplying numbers modulo some prime number. And if we are operating in such a group where we are multiplying modulo prime number, we can also identify a so-called generator, which can generate all the other elements as powers of itself. And this naturally leads to the question, if I have such a generator which can generate all other numbers y, how to generate them? So how big is x, how often do I need to multiply g to itself in order to generate y when computing modulo p? And we said that this problem is very closely related to the DiffieHellman problem at the core of the DiffieHellman crypto system. We also had a look at another example of a hard problem that is used a lot in cryptography, and that's the integer factorization problem, or IFP, where we are given a number and we want to factor it into its prime factors. And specifically, we had a look at the one case where p is actually the product of exactly 2 large primes, and we want to find exactly those 2 large primes. And we said that this is closely related to the RSA problem of finding the message in an RSA encrypted from an RSA encrypted ciphertext and the public key. Okay, so let's have a look at the recap quiz and first at the question. So you will notice I have deleted one or two questions that don't really fit into the lecture, I think, like what sort of appliances I have in my home. I mean, the answer is no, but I'm not going to discuss that in more detail. Okay, so that settles all the questions I see, actually. So we can start right into the quiz. Let's see. Let's wait until Menti is ready as well. In the meantime, while you're joining, I can have a look at the other questions that appeared. So one of the questions, while we're waiting for people to join, one of the questions is, what exactly is a generator? Somebody said that they didn't quite catch that. So a generator is a number modulo p, so a number between 0 and p minus 1, that can generate all other numbers as powers of itself. So if you look at the element g and g squared and g to the power of 3 and g to the power of 4 and so on, all of these powers are going to lead to different numbers modulo p. And in fact, if you look at all the powers you can generate all the numbers less than p this way, so after reduction modulo p. So for example, if we're looking at computation modulo 3, then 2 is a generator, because 2 to the power is 1. That's great, that's one number generated. 2 to the power of 2, that's 4. Modulo 3, that's 1. So we can also generate the number 1 with it. And the only number we haven't generated yet is the number 0. That one doesn't count because it's not part of the multiplicative group. So we don't need to generate it. So 2 is a generator. It generates both 1 and 2. If we look at further powers, like 2 to the number of 3, that's 8. Modulo 3, that's 2 again. We've already generated 2. So you see, after you've generated all numbers, you run into cycles and regenerate them all. That's to be expected. Okay, so I'll mark that question as answered afterwards. And in the meantime, somebody else was also wondering whether this stream is running from my home or from TU Graz. It's actually running from home, but some people also stream from the streaming studio we have at the Institute. Okay, I think that was enough time to join the quiz. I don't see that many people yet, actually. Let's see how well that number matches the number of viewers on the stream. Ah, well, okay. I see we're getting fewer and fewer every week, so I guess that's all we have for the moment. Okay, so let's have a look at the quiz questions. The first one. In public key encryption schemes, who is the owner of the private key? Is it A, the sender, B, the recipient, or C, the verifier? Oh, there's quite a tie between two most popular answers. Let's have a look at both. So some people believe it's the sender and some people believe it's the recipient. Now notice that I'm talking here about public key encryption schemes, not signatures or anything. So in an encryption scheme, everybody can use the public key to encrypt something for somebody else, but only the owner of the private key can decrypt it. So this means the recipient of a message needs to have the private key. The sender only needs to have the public key. The thing changes if I talk about signature schemes instead of public key encryption schemes. In a signature scheme, the person who generates the signature, so the sender of the signature, needs to have the private key, and the verifier works with the public key. So you see, in one of the applications it's the sender and in one it's the recipient, but in encryption schemes specifically, the recipient needs the key. Okay, next question. So which of these three-letter acronyms is a signature scheme besides maybe something else? So one option is SHA-2, one option is RSA, and one option is DiffieHellman. So which of these is a signature scheme? And this time the majority is very clearly right, yes. So the other RSA can be used both as an encryption scheme, public key encryption scheme, or as a signature scheme. And we'll see in a moment how the similarity between the two is. So SHA-2 is not a signature scheme, it's a hash function, so it doesn't need any keys at all, but it's often used together with a signature scheme. So you always sign the hash of a message. But it's not the signing stuff, so the signing algorithm itself. It's just an ingredient that we use. And DiffieHellman is not a signature scheme, but a key exchange scheme. Okay, let's have a look at the next one. Now it gets mathematical. And let's see if it finally decides to show. It doesn't decide to show. Let's see if it helps to quickly switch to streaming, to the Q&A. I've already answered that one and that one. Let's get back to the quiz and see if it starts now. Seems very lazy this morning. So it's actually showing in the background what's the multiplicative inverse of 2 modulo 7. So is it 1, 2, 3, or 4? You have a little more time for this one to calculate. Okay, so lovers for every number. Of course, every number is beautiful, but 4 is the correct answer in this case. Let's quickly check why. So the multiplicative inverse of 2 needs to satisfy that this number times 2 equals 1 modulo 7. 1 times 2 is 2. 2 times 2 is 4, so that's also wrong. 3 times 2 is 6, so that's also wrong, that would be -1. But 4 times 2 modulo 7 is indeed 1, so 4 is the multiplicative inverse of 2. Okay, next question. In the discrete logarithm problem, which value in this equation does the attacker have to find? Is it g, x, y, or p? So 3 of the numbers are given, 1 he needs to find. So indeed, the majority is right. So g is a known value, that's the generator. Y, the target number, the challenge number, is also known, otherwise we couldn't answer the challenge. The modulus is generally fixed, it's actually usually the same for every user of the encryption system. And x is the unknown value that we are trying to retrieve. For example, in DiffieHellman, x is the private key. So one more. It's trying to load the results already. I think it's a bit early for that. It shouldn't do that. Let's see if it is willing to just show the next question. Let's see if refreshing helps. Maybe we have to skip that question. It really doesn't want to load. Oh, it does. Okay, now that I'm talking badly about it, it actually does. Let's have a look. So in RSA signatures, how does signing work? So the process of signing is just like RSA encryption or just like RSA decryption? Or is it maybe like DiffieHellman key generation? Ooh, this is the first. The majority put their stakes on the wrong horse. So let's have a look at why that is. We already said that RSA signatures are similar to RSA encryption schemes, so the algorithms are similar. However, the RSA public key encryption scheme has two algorithms, encryption and decryption. For encryption, we use the public key, but for decryption, we use the private key. Otherwise, the operations is essentially the same. In RSA signatures, we need the private key to sign. So the private key is the one that is used in RSA decryption. So that's why I'd say it's closer to RSA decryption, because it uses the same kind of key material. Not RSA encryption, which uses a different kind of key. But of course, the mathematical operations are very similar in either case. But it's a very big difference whether you're doing it with the public or with the private key. And you should also consider that the public key is usually chosen a bit differently than the private key. So that also strengthens this answer here. Because in the public key, you can, for example, choose a relatively small number that will allow people to, for example, verify the signature more efficiently or encrypt more efficiently. The private key shouldn't be a small number. Okay, so we have one more question, even though the counter says something else. So which problematic property does textbook RSA encryption have? Is it unpredictable or deterministic or not bijective? So one of these is the case for RSA encryption and it's a problem. Which one? Oh wow, to compensate for the previous questions, now everybody got this one right. Yes, the big problem is that encryption is deterministic. So if I encrypt the same thing twice, I get the same ciphertext twice. We already saw in symmetric encryption that this is kinda bad, but in public key encryption, it's much worse than that because everybody can actually do the encryption. So if you would try to guess what the plaintext is and just want to verify the answer, you could very easily do that in textbook RSA. This would defeat the confidentiality property of RSA. What did we do to fix that? We randomized the encryption by adding a random padding, which then randomizes the ciphertext. Okay, thanks a lot for participating. Let's have a look at the leaderboard. Wolfgang Slani is in the top 2, but the winner is Oda Wim. Sorry, I'm not sure how to pronounce your nick, but congratulations anyways. Okay, so let's get back to the slides then. And let's have a look at what's planned for today. So the lecture has 2 main parts. The first one is probably going mostly before the break, and after the break we're going to have a look at the second one. So first I want to have a look at different types of protocols. The main focus is going to be on one very representative protocol that everybody is using a lot and that has shaped many other protocols. And this is the so-called TLS protocol. And one of the reasons it's so influential, or why I think it's so important to understand, is that it provides an additional security property that we haven't met yet, and it's called forward secrecy. We're also going to have a look at how to practically implement this stuff, and one of the most important ingredients for that is having certificates. And finally, I want to look at a few other protocols, some of them for privacy, some of them for communication, with just a few look at how they are different from TLS, or what specific challenges they are trying to tackle. In the second part, I want to discuss different aspects related to cryptographic security. The first topic is, where do we actually get all the key material from? So what should we pay attention to when we do that, generating keys? A second part is going to be about a particular kind of threat that we haven't discussed yet, because so far we've always been discussing a so-called classical adversary, which just has a regular computer. If an adversary gets access to a quantum computer that is large enough, which we currently don't have yet, but if they are developed at some point and an attacker gets access to one, we are in a completely different situation, and I want to have a brief look at that situation. And finally, some practical issues and crypto failures. Okay, so let's dive into the protocols. TLS and more is the headline. So let's first have a look at which ingredients we now have that we can use for communication. We already previously said in the last lecture that we need this asymmetric cryptography stuff in order to establish some kind of key material, and afterwards we can use symmetric cryptography to actually send each other encrypted and integrity protected messages. So this is a very basic principle. This has different names. So some people call it hybrid encryption, so hybrid between symmetric and asymmetric. Some people call a specific variant of it ChemDem, which is short for a key encryption data encryption mechanism. So first you encrypt or exchange a key, and then you actually exchange the data using that key, and so on. So that's the basic principle. Let's have a look at the first ingredient we already have for that, and one of its very important limitations that one of you actually also already raised in a question last week. So this very important protocol that we can use for key exchange, and that is actually used almost everywhere, is the DiffieHellman scheme. If you remember, we said that we have some public system parameters in that everybody can use, and then to set up a key between Alice and Bob each come up with a private key, which we call A and B here. And of course, they don't send each other that private key, they send the corresponding public keys, which is A to the power of alpha to the power of A and alpha to the power of B, where alpha is some public generator. Now the attacker shouldn't be able to get back from this value to the private keys. But for Alice and Bob, who have received each other's public keys, they can derive the following shared session key by taking the value that they received and raising it to the power of their own exponent. Thanks to the exponentiation rules, this actually gives the same result. And that already sounds nice and sounds like we're finished, but there are two very important issues with this protocol. Why we can't just use it as is by itself. The first issue is that it doesn't provide authenticity. So they send each other their public keys, but Alice never knows if she actually receives this public key from Bob, or whether there was maybe a man in the middle, or actually a woman in the middle, Eve, who intercepted the original public key that Bob sent and sends her own, so Eve's evil public key to Alice. So that would mean Alice would actually set up communication with some third party Eve instead of the actual Bob. And Eve could just sit happily in the middle and receive messages from Eve, forward them to Bob, and vice versa, and could read everything in between. So that would be horrible. So that's why this lack of authenticity is an issue here. There's a second issue, and that is that this scheme doesn't have what's called forward secrecy. What that means is, in case Alice's private key leaks at some point, for example, at some point in time her computer is compromised and her secret key leaks. In that case, all of the past communications that she set up with Bob are compromised. Because everybody who maybe listened to this conversation at some point and stored this information and later intercepted Alice's key, or maybe didn't even listen to the messages but just happens to know Bob's public key and at some point learns Alice's private key, can recover her session keys and thus decrypt all the following messages she exchanged before or after that day. So the key is compromised into the past and into the future. And this is a big issue, something we don't want to have. And there are still a few schemes which ignore these issues to some extent and just use DiffieHellman, but there are also ways to solve both of these problems. Let's first have a look at a few examples that do actually use this so-called static asymmetric cryptography. Let me also see if the question is related to that. No, the question is not related to that, so let's have a look at it later. Okay. If we use the scheme as is and always keep the same private and public key, then this is called static asymmetric cryptography. So this means we use a long-term public and private key, so Alice and Bob both have their long-term public and private keys, and they use these to agree on a key. They could use DiffieHellman like on the previous slide, or they could also have keys for RSA encryption and could use RSA encryption to encrypt the session key and send it to the other person. And the other person decrypts it with their private key and uses that for the future communication. So either way, they use asymmetric cryptography with a long-term key to set up the symmetric key and then use a symmetric session key for symmetric encryption and MAC. Or just encryption if you're really sure that's what you want. So there are a few schemes which do essentially that. One of the schemes is OpenPGP. So that's a system for email encryption, but also encrypting other stuff, but it's mostly used in emails. How does it work? Well, somebody who uses OpenPGP generates a public-private key pair at some point, publishes their public key on a key pool or on a key server, and everybody else can get the long-term public key from there. Ideally, this has some additional authenticity protection because somebody actually asked Alice, is this key on the key pool actually your public key? And Alice said, yes, here is what my public key looks like. So, for example, they could compare what's called a public key fingerprint, which is just a short hash of the public key to make it easier to match, because public keys can be really large. That's what somebody who wants to use OpenPGP could do, publishing their public key, and then everybody could use this public key to encrypt a temporary symmetric key, send it to the owner of the private key. The owner of the private key unwraps it and uses it to then decrypt the message they received alongside it, which was encrypted with exactly that symmetric key. So just like I described in the static approach above. And of course, we kind of need this long-term public key here because it's actually published on a key server. And also, emails are usually sent in an asynchronous way. So the recipient isn't actually online live while you're sending it. So that's why you can't use something like DiffieHellman. You need something that can be sent off once and read at a later point without direct interaction. So that's what OpenPGP does, and its authenticity, so it doesn't provide forward secrecy. Its authenticity relies on the fact that at some point people actually check whether the key on the key server, which says this is Alice's key column, blah 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 blah, long hex string, that this is actually verified. For example, at a key signing party, people can then sign the public key if they actually verified that it belongs to Alice. An approach that is kind of similar, but where the authenticity works different, is SMIME, which is also primarily used for emails, but can also be used to encrypt other stuff. It also has these long-term public keys, but instead of publishing them on a key server and just hoping that some people verify the key by hand, what it does instead is it provides certificates. A certificate is a guarantee that somebody actually checked. Somebody who is an authority, a certification authority, actually checked that the public key belongs to Bob. And the certification authority then issues a certificate that says this is actually Bob's or Alice's public key. And here's my stamp of approval on that. So it doesn't work in a peer-to-peer fashion like this one, but it's more authority-based. You actually need some authority that you trust, that you both trust. But otherwise, it works similarly in that it also needs to use this long-term key. Okay, so these are sort of oldish protocols that have been around for quite a while. This static approach is also, to the best of my knowledge, I don't know if this is still up to date, but I think so, also used in iMessage. So iMessage, the chat app on the Apple ecosystem, and there you also essentially have such static long-term keys, except that you don't actually have any means of verifying them. So you can't even display the public key that you're using from your chat partner. You're trusting Apple that Apple actually gave you the correct public key. So these are different approaches to solving the authenticity part. They all have some limitations, and additionally, they don't really provide any forward secrecy. So what can we do to fix both of these issues? And this solution is called ephemeral DiffieHellman, or for short, DHE. What's the basic idea? The basic idea is that Alice and Bob both don't just have one public key pair, like a public and private key, but they actually have two at any time. One is a long-term key, but it isn't actually used directly for exchanging the key, only for signing. So the only key that's used for a long time is always only used for signing. And for actually exchanging the key, you have a second ephemeral single-use key pair. So ephemeral means something like temporary. And this is the one you use for the actual DiffieHellman key exchange. So why does that make sense? Or what does it help to use this short-term key? Well, it means that if you execute the DiffieHellman protocol with this short-term key, first you get a fresh symmetric session key every time. In the standard DiffieHellman, you would always get the same symmetric key with the same communication partner, which is a bit of a problem in itself. If you use a temporary key, of course, you also get just a temporary symmetric session key. And you prevent this man-of-the-middle attack that I mentioned by using the signatures for authentication. So you not only send Bob your temporary public key for DiffieHellman, but you also sign this temporary public key with your long-term private key. This way, Bob can authenticate that this actually came from you. So you can use one of the previous schemes like certificates to ensure that the long-term key is authentic. So you still need to rely on some mechanism for that, like for example, a certificate. But if you know that, you can also verify that the temporary DiffieHellman key pair came from Alice. And what does it have to help to have this temporary key? Well, just after establishing your new session key with DiffieHellman, you can simply throw away the private keys. If you throw them away, they can't leak anymore. So if you delete them safely. And you won't need them anymore because the next time you try to talk, you just come up with a fresh private key. And if some fresh private key at 5 years later is leaked, this doesn't compromise any of the previous keys because they were completely independent. So you can't recover any of the previous ones, and so you also can't recover any of the previous symmetric session keys. Okay, so we need authentication, but this authentication step allows us to have these temporary keys. There's an additional point here in the middle, and that is that in addition to just using the signatures, we also do one additional confirmation step. Namely, at the end of DiffieHellman, the people actually immediately use the established session key, which we call W here. I should maybe write that in the text here, that this is called W. So they use this value, this session key W, and immediately send each other the MAC of some message in order to confirm that they actually know W. So this is called key confirmation, and it's a security property in its own right, to make sure that they both actually have agreed on the same key. It's like a sort of safety mechanism. Okay, so these are the essential differences: using temporary keys, authenticating these temporary keys with a long-term key, and finally adding this key confirmation step. So this isn't strictly necessary to achieve the two previous problems, but it's still a good thing to do. And so most protocols actually do something like that. So how is this implemented, for example, in TLS? So TLS is short for Transport Layer Security. So apparently it's supposed to protect some sort of transport layer, if you think of the network layer model. And this transport layer it is supposed to secure is the one used in HTTP. And if you do use the TLS protocol, then you get HTTPS, which you hopefully get for any website that you're using. This is sometimes called SSL instead, so you might actually be more familiar with the term SSL because it's advertised by many web shops or so, and has been for many years. But SSL is actually the insecure predecessor of TLS. So TLS is the thing you should use, and which you actually always use. It's just that SSL is a bit more well known, so you still find the term very often. Sometimes people also write TLS/SSL to allow people to recognize SSL, but still use the actually correct term TLS. SSL was, I think, Secure Sockets Layer or something like that. Okay. So how does TLS implement that? Let's first have a look at the question I just saw appeared. So first let's have a look at the previous question, which has been here for some time, which is asking whether I take part in CTFs. No, I actually don't. I unfortunately don't have the time for that. But we have a great student team and also some doctoral students who actually do. Okay, there's a second question. What can happen if a website is not HTTPS? Well, if a website is not HTTPS, then the content that is transmitted is not protected. It's neither encrypted nor integrity protected. So somebody who intercepts this traffic, for example, because they're in the same Wi-Fi as you, or because for some other reasons they're sitting on one of the many hops that HTTP traffic travels through while you are making a request to the server, they can all read your message like a postcard and manipulate it if they like to. So for example, if you enter your password on a site that's only HTTP and not HTTPS, then you send your password in plain text and everybody can read it. So everybody on the way, whether they are sitting in the same Wi-Fi or somewhere else along the many hops. They could also manipulate it. So for example, if you send a money transaction over an HTTP secured connection, they could essentially change, for example, the amount of money or something that you're sending. Of course, banks have their own additional security layers on top, and of course they all use HTTPS, so that doesn't really happen. But that's what could happen if you didn't try to use proper cryptography. Okay, good. So let's close the Q&A and get back to the slide, and let's have a look at the 3 layers in the TLS handshake. So the first layer is the actual key exchange that we've seen before. So this is the first part of the handshake protocol. Establishing the key with ephemeral DiffieHellman. And in the second step, we then verify the authenticity of this exchange. So we actually check using a signature, or like we've seen just on the previous slide, a signature over the DiffieHellman exchange, plus afterwards maybe this MAC exchange, to confirm to each other who we are. So in particular in HTTPS, actually you don't usually prove to the server who you are, but only the server proves to you who they are. So it's actually a one-sided authentication very often. TLS supports both one-sided and double-sided. So if TLS is run between 2 machines who both have certificates, then they both authenticate each other. If you're just a user calling a website, then actually it's not really relevant for the website who you are, it's just relevant for you to know that you're talking with the right website. As soon as it's relevant for the website to know who you are, the website needs to have its own login mechanism, for example, password-based login or something, before it tells you any secrets. But of course, you have to tell the website your secrets, like your password. So you need to authenticate. So these are the 2 parts of the handshake protocol. And after that, we have what's called the application data phase, where you exchange actually all the content you want to exchange with the website. So for example, the website sends its HTML to you, and maybe you send some queries back to it. And this is protected then with symmetric cryptography, and in particular with authenticated encryption. So this is very similarly done in other protocols. One difference is that many older protocols don't directly do authenticated encryption, but they try to somehow plug it together from an encryption scheme and a MAC. We've already seen this can often go wrong. TLS in the most recent version, which is TLS version 1.3, actually properly specifies that you should use authenticated encryption, as it should be. So let's have a look at these phases in a bit more detail, and let's have a look at what values are actually sent between the 2 parties. And the following, I'm going to call the 2 parties the client and the server rather than Alice and Bob, because most often they are client and server. So let's look at phase 1, which is the key exchange. So we already know this is DiffieHellman. So we already know that the client, when it tries to make a connection to the server, is going to have to send their DiffieHellman public key. And that's exactly what happens. So the client, when it connects to a website, first comes up with a temporary DiffieHellman key, so an ephemeral DiffieHellman key, and sends this as part of a so-called client hello message to the server. But the client hello also includes some additional values that are going to be useful. First, it includes some randomness, which is later going to be used as a basis for the nonces for the authenticated encryption. And additionally, it sends along which ciphers it actually likes to use. So a list of preferred symmetric cipher suits. And to be more correct, actually the client might not just send one DiffieHellman public key. Actually, if it isn't sure what the server's preferences are, because there are like different key sizes that you could want to use, or there are different DiffieHellman variants, for example, on different so-called elliptic curves that you might want to use. And in that case, the client might actually send or generate private keys for each of these different cipher variants that it supports and sends all of them to the server. And the server picks whichever of the public keys it likes best, so whatever its preferences regarding the DiffieHellman variant are, and sends back a very similar server hello message, where it also says, okay, this is my public key. Now, since the server has already seen which ciphers the client likes, it can pick one of those and only send one public key back to the client, and also says something about what its preferred symmetric crypto is, and it also sends along some randomness. And these two randomness inputs are then later going to be used as a basis for the nonces and some other intermediate values where we need randomness. So in the notation here, I've always used this server symbol for all the values that the server generates, and the laptop symbol for all the values the client generates. Let's have a look at the question that has appeared. So the first question is, if HTTP is so insecure, why are HTTP only websites even allowed? Well, you can't really forbid anyone to communicate insecurely. However, there has really been a big improvement in the past few years. So if I look back something like 5 to 10 years, large parts of the internet were actually unencrypted. By now, that's no longer the case. So by now, really almost everything is encrypted, is using HTTPS. And most browsers will actually show you very fat warnings in case you don't use HTTPS. So they might even not allow you to connect or say something like, this connection is insecure. You should stop here. Are you really sure you want to proceed? So they really try to make some big fat red flags in case you accidentally go to an HTTP only site. I think you will hear about some additional technical measures that try to enforce that HTTPS is actually used, such as HSTS. This might appear later in the secure applications part. At least I think so. But as I said, you can't forbid people to communicate insecurely. But secure communication is the prerequisite for most sorts of certificates, for example, for online shops or so. Like these security TÜV badges and so on. So these TÜV badges that you see on some old-fashioned websites are actually saying secure using SSL. Then there is a question whether I could explain a bit more what static asymmetric cryptography means. I can mention the difference to this non-static version again in a moment when we get to that slide, okay? And there's one other question. What if Eve intercepts the handshake mechanism between the client and server handshake in TLS? That we can answer right away because you're on the right slide. So the question is related to this meet in the middle attack that we said before. So we said this is a simple DiffieHellman. What makes it non-static is that the client uses a fresh DiffieHellman key that he just generated, and the server also uses a completely fresh key. In a static system, they would use their long-term private DiffieHellman key, so it would always be the same. So whenever the client would talk to the server in classic DiffieHellman, they would always use the same key, and thus always get the same output as a result. And this has the issues that I mentioned before: no forward secrecy and no authenticity. And here we actually try to achieve both forward secrecy and authentication. We'll get to the authentication in a moment. For the forward secrecy, it's important to see we have these fresh keys here. So if this particular private key is leaked at some point, it doesn't threaten any of the past or future communications because they are completely independent of this particular communication. They don't share the same private key. As for the authentication, so that's also with reference to the question we just saw, if you look just at this slide, then somebody could actually intercept or interrupt this communication, try to sit here in between, take the client hello message and send a different client hello onward to the server, also intercept the server hello and send a different fake server value back to the client. The way to prevent this is exactly what's written on the next slide, and that's the authentication part. So how does the authentication work? How do we prevent this issue? We prevent it by also having a long-term key pair for signing. And what the server now does as the next step is he takes the messages that have been exchanged so far. So this is called tau here. Tau is short for the transcript. It simply means essentially taking the byte dump of this communication here. It's simply taking that byte string and signing it with his long-term private key. Sending that to the client, so that's the certificate verify. And in addition to that, you also need to give the client some means of actually verifying the signature. And this means not just having access to the public key, but also being able to verify that this public key belongs exactly to the website I want to talk to. And this is written down in the certificate. So the certificate says this website uses this public key and comes with a stamp from a certification authority. We'll have a look at that in a moment. And this transcript actually also includes this certificate step. That's why it's called certificate verify. So this allows now the client, after looking at these messages, to verify that they're talking to the server of the right website. And the server also sends some additional information along, including some encrypted key extensions which can be empty, and a finished message. So this is the end of the handshake from the server's perspective. And to confirm this end and to confirm all that has happened before, and to confirm that the server actually has successfully completed DiffieHellman, we now use the key that both of them have derived from DiffieHellman in order to compute a MAC, specifically an HMAC, which is a hash-based MAC, of the transcript up to this point. So this transcript now also includes all of these messages here. And we compute a MAC over this whole thing, so a checksum, and send it over to the client. The client receives all of that. The client first verifies the certificate and the signature, and finally they verify the message authentication tag. If you remember, a MAC is a symmetric thing, so it's using a symmetric key now. And then the client uses exactly the same symmetric key to send a similar finished message, which also includes a MAC over everything that has happened above. So this way, with these two messages, server and client confirm to each other that they were able to successfully complete everything beforehand and that they know the shared secret key. After this, they can use the shared secret key for actual application data. So here we have authenticated encryption running, and using the key we just established and using the nonce material as a basis that we exchanged in the first step to send each other encrypted ciphertext with authentication tags. And to derive the exact AES key, for example, from this number that we learn or that we have at the end of DiffieHellman, we plug this big number into, for example, a key derivation function to sort of hash it to a key of the right size. Okay, so if you wondered why I skipped all this text below, that's just writing down what I explained in Word so that you can check it afterwards on the slides. Okay, so that's TLS. And there's this one ingredient that we haven't discussed in detail yet, and that's the certificates. So how exactly the client knows that it's using the right public key of the right website. And this is done with certificates, more specifically with so-called X509 certificates. So X509 is simply the name of the standard that is used everywhere for certificates. So it's used to tie a public key to an identity. where an identity is, for example, a website URL. So that's the identity of the server or of the website. So what does it contain, a certificate? First, it needs to contain the public key that we're talking about. So this is the long-term signing public key of the server. This must be in the certificate. Additionally, we need to say who does the certificate actually belong to. So which identity are we talking about? Like, for example, a host name, or it can also be a person's name. So if we are talking, for example, about certificates for email encryption, the public key would be a public RSA encryption key, and the identity would be the email address and maybe the name of the person it belongs to. So it would tie a particular public key, for example, to my IAIK email address. And additionally, there is some extra stuff in there that sort of limits the validity of the certificate. So, for example, a certificate is not valid forever. It has a certain validity period for a number of reasons. One of the reasons is that after a while, you might want to upgrade to the current best practice crypto systems. For example, some certificate. So the validity period depends a bit on what kind of certificate we're talking about. A website certificate usually doesn't hold that long, so a couple of months, for example, maybe a year. A certificate of a certification authority, which we'll get to in a moment, has a much longer period, and that can actually be a problem in case cryptography progresses in the meantime. So, for example, some very, very, very old certificates, which have maybe been around for something like 15 or even 20 years, might still use crypto schemes which we wouldn't use anymore today. Like, for example, MD5 or SHA-1 as a hash function, or public key sizes which are simply too small by today's standards. Like something like 1000-bit keys or something. And for this reason, we have a limited validity period. There are also other mechanisms that limit the validity of certificates. So in particular, certificates can also be revoked. So in case, for example, we notice that the private key of some certificate was compromised, we might invalidate the certificate by revoking it. How is this implemented? For example, with certificate revocation lists. So the authority which issues all these certificates usually also publishes such revocation lists, where it lists all the certificates that are no longer valid. So this, of course, can't be written inside the certificate, because once the certificate is issued, it's just a file and it stays like that. But you can have such external mechanisms to limit the validity of a certificate. And finally, the very most important ingredient is the stamp of approval on the certificate, to make sure somebody just didn't write this up, but somebody actually verified all of this, somebody trusted. And this trusted party is the certification authority, who is also called the issuer of the certificate. So they give out the certificate. And so what the CA does is they sign this entire certificate and attach the signature to the certificate. But now, of course, we've run into a sort of loop problem, right? So we now have written a certificate to certify a signing key, and to make sure this is valid, we've protected it with another signature. But how do we know that the signature is actually from the valid CA? So how do we know that the public key that was used here is authentic? Well, we can recursively have a certificate for that public key. But how do we protect that? Well, with another certificate, and so on. So actually, when you get a certificate, you usually get a whole certificate chain, where each certificate certifies the validity of another certificate. But of course, this chain must end somewhere. I must have some final thing I trust. And this final thing is the so-called root certificate from a root CA. These are usually CAs which have certificates with a very long validity period, and these root certificates are provided to you by the software vendor that you're using. For example, Firefox or Chrome, or also operating systems, they ship with their own small list of trusted root CA certificates. you can imagine that in international communications, it's actually a bit hard to agree on whom we all trust. So whether I sit in Russia or in the US or in China, I need to agree on somebody that we all trust. So this is why this list of root CAs is relatively short. But the root CAs can in turn certify like more local CAs, and the more local CAs can, for example, issue the website certificates. Okay, so we need some common baseline. So in the end, you've already seen in cryptography, we always move or shift the trust somewhere else, somewhere that's easier to protect. And in this case, we've shifted all of the authenticity issues back to this root CA. And the root CA is actually the root of our trust. But it still means we need to trust someone. But of course, there's a baseline of things we need to trust, otherwise we wouldn't be able to work it all. For example, if you don't trust your OS, if you don't trust your browser, you can't trust anything you're doing online. So this is a basic common denominator we can sort of agree on. Let's have a look at an example, but because the next slide is very full, let's have a look at the question right here. So one question is whether I can add the info with the root CA to the slides. Yes, I think that's a good idea. It's sort of covered on the next slides, but a bit implicitly. I tried to make it more explicit. I hope I remember that. Maybe you can write a comment in the YouTube chat to remind me of that, to make sure I don't forget. And there's another question, sorry that it's a bit hard to read, and that's whether a proxy plus HTTP is enough to communicate securely, or is it also insecure? So the idea of that question is, instead of directly protecting my connection with some server, I'm using a sort of tunnel around this communication to protect the communication around it. Like, for example, a proxy, and my encryption to the proxy is trusted. But the question is, how does the proxy talk to the website? How is that secured? So I would say it's not necessarily secure. And of course, you include somebody else in your trust chain, and that's your proxy, whom you would allow to read and modify all of the communication that you are sending them. And that's something different than just trusting your proxy to build up a secure tunnel with you, because additionally, you trust them to not exploit this asymmetric situation that you're in, that they could have a secure tunnel with you, but still use the information that they see you are sending. So for example, they could read all your passwords, which is not usually what you want. So for this reason, I would say no. It defends against certain kinds of third-party attackers, which sit between you and the proxy and try to intercept that information, so that can be prevented. But you don't protect against somebody evil working at the proxy, trying to exploit your information, or something in between the proxy and the actual website. Okay, so now let's have a look at what this looks like, or how you can actually have a look at all these certificates. So as an example here, I've picked Firefox, but really the situation is very similar in other browsers. So if you established a connection somewhere, like for example, I went to Wikipedia, you can see on top here, well, I can't point there because the camera ends there, but you see this log symbol, which means you're using HTTPS. You can also see it in the URL. If you click on that symbol, you usually get to this security information that I'm listing here. So if I look at the security tab, what you get is some information like the owner of the certificate you're talking to. So that's wikipedia.org. That would be the identity here. Then you have information about who verified this. So who is the certification authority that issued this certificate? And that's Let's Encrypt, which is the CA you will nowadays find everywhere across the web, because they've made it really easy and convenient to get website certificates. So that's why they are used all over, and they're also trusted by quite many partners because they have collaborations with many known software and hardware vendors. You also see some of this extra information. So you see the expiration date. So you can see that obviously I didn't take the screenshot right before this lecture, but I took it last year when I had the lecture. So that was also in October, and you saw that at that time, last October, the certificate for Wikipedia was valid until mid-December last year. So that would be about 1.5 months forward. If you click on the View Certificate, you get some more information. Actually, you get to see the chain, the certificate chain. So if you open it, you see first the leftmost value here. That's the actual website certificate. So it always says here in the label of the tab, it says who the certificate is certifying. And we see that the bottommost certificate that certifies the actual website was issued to wikipedia.org. So this subject or common name is always the identity whom the certificate is for. We see who issued it, so that's Let's Encrypt, who's sitting in the US, who also has a standardized string for the common name. And you see the validity, so you see when it was issued, so it's not valid before that date, that's sometime mid-September, and it's not valid after December. So that means the validity period for this certificate would be 3 months. After that time, Wikipedia would need to get a fresh certificate from the same authentication authority usually. And you can see there are also some alternative names, which are additional domains that can also be protected with the certificate. So for example, those are all the websites that are affiliated with Wikipedia, like Wikimedia and Wikidata and Wikibooks and so on. So that's the first tab. If you click on the second tab, you can see that the name of this is some authority, so the Let's Encrypt Certification Authority. So they issued the certificate for Wikipedia and verified that this is actually the public key of Wikipedia. But their certificate was in turn signed by some root CA. So CA is short for Certification Authority. You will see this acronym a lot. And in that case, the root CA is the DST root CA. So the certificate of this root CA actually shipped with your browser. And it doesn't have an external signature, so the root certificate is actually self-signed. So the CA signs its own certificate. Okay, so you can find some more technical information about the certificate if you click somewhere on the details button, which I don't see here. But what you get in that case is this information. So here you get more information about the crypto that this certificate is valid for. So it says here, we have a public key for an elliptic curve crypto system. We'll get to that in a moment. So it's not RSA, it's not classic Diffie-Hellman, it's an elliptic curve system. You can see the key size here, so it's using 250-bit keys, which is actually a bit small for asymmetric cryptography, but we'll see in a moment that it's quite okay. It specifies which specific variant, so that would be like saying which modulus exactly you're using, except in curves you call it a curve and not a modulus. And you have the public value here, so that's the public key, written as a long hex string. And you have some extra information here, like for example, you can read how the certificate was signed. So the signature algorithm that was used here is RSA signature. For some very weird reason that I really hate, it says RSA encryption here, but really it means it's using RSA signatures. And it's using the signature together with the SHA-2 hash function. And the certificate also has a serial number, which is listed here. You can get an encoded version of this, so a file containing this information if you click here. So PEM is simply a file format, how to save, how to store a certificate. And on the bottom here, you can see some fingerprints of this certificate, which you can compare if you want to see if it's the same certificate as some other ones. I think that should also contain the hash of the public key as part of it. There are some additional constraints for what kind of use this certificate is valid. So in particular, a certificate always has to say whether it's allowed to sign other certificates or not. So it says here, basic constraints, that's the name of this property. Certificate authority no. This means that Wikipedia is not allowed to act as a CA and sign other certificates. So in order to be allowed to do that, you actually need to have a certificate which says you are a certificate authority. And it also says what the key is for, the public key, so that should actually really be on top here. It's for digital signatures. So this is a public key that can be used for signing, and Wikipedia uses it to sign the handshake in HTTPS. Okay, so how do you get such a certificate if you're running your own website? Well, thankfully, it's quite easy nowadays. For example, with Let's Encrypt, which was founded by a number of large companies, Google and many others, because they wanted to agree on some common scheme that they trust, that they can use, and that's reliable to secure the web. And that's exactly what Let's Encrypt does. So if you want instructions on how to do it, go there. What you essentially need to do is you need to equip your server with some means of talking to Let's Encrypt so that it can actually answer some requests from Let's Encrypt, and so that you prove that you have access to that server and you can control what runs there. And if you can show that, then they will issue you a certificate for that host name. And the certificates that they issue are valid for 90 days, like the one for Wikipedia we just saw. And they actually have a very convenient bot system, so the cert bot system, to automatically renew the certificates every 3 months. So you don't actually have to do anything, you just have to set it up once, and every 3 months, Let's Encrypt and your server will talk to each other using this bot system here in order to set up a new certificate. Let's have a look at the Q&A. So what if a man in the middle poses as Wikipedia and as Let's Encrypt and just signs them himself? So I'm not sure how to exactly understand this question because there are several potential interpretations. One interpretation would be, what if Let's Encrypt is malicious and issues a fake certificate that says this is the key for Wikipedia, but actually it's the key for some scammer, for some attacker. And they try to lure people into believing that they are the actual Wikipedia. Well, that's absolutely possible. So if the certificate authority is evil and certifies incorrect things, there's no technical means of preventing that. Except as soon as it happens and is discovered, the certificate of the CA is probably going to be revoked and they can't do any further damage. But they could do this actually. So an evil CA is also sometimes called a rogue CA. Okay, so like in the Star Wars movie title. Okay, so this is possible if Let's Encrypt is actually malicious. So this is why you need to trust CAs so much, and why you also need to trust the root CAs to be very picky in whom else they give CA certificates. So whom else they allow to certify somebody. Because of course, the further you are from the root CA, the less control the root CA really has anymore. If somebody in all of this chain goes evil, then you have a big mess. So it does happen occasionally, but very rarely, thankfully. Because since the CAs are sort of tangible legal entities, there are easy ways to, for example, to prosecute them, or to, since this is a criminal or a legal offense, you can actually act against them, because that's one of the prerequisites for being a CA, that you're sort of a tangible legal entity. If you mean that somebody sits in between Let's Encrypt or Wikipedia or something like that, that should be prevented by the setup procedure. So if Let's Encrypt is trustworthy, then somebody else should not be able to get a fake certificate, because this is technically prevented by this setup here. If somebody just claims to be Let's Encrypt and self-signs their own certificate and tries to be a root CA, this is prevented because this evil entity would not be included, for example, as a root certificate in your Firefox browser. It would not ship with them, hopefully. So there have been a few disputed root CAs included in different systems in the past, but I'm not aware of any big incidents related to that. So there's one other question. What if you want to have an HTTPS website? You have to implement TLS by yourself. No, please don't. So please do not try to implement all of the crypto details yourself. Instead, you use a library for that. For example, OpenSSL is a very famous one. So you instead install this library, which does everything for you. You just need to set it up correctly. So you need to equip it with your key material, with your private key, so that the library can do all the work for you. All you need to do is to get a certificate and to set up an existing TLS library. So there are different libraries. I mentioned OpenSSL because it's very widely used and also one of the most analyzed implementations. It still has issues every now and then. So every year there are some headlines that there was another security bug in OpenSSL. For example, one of the more famous bugs was the heartbleed bug, but there are tons of other ones, or side channel vulnerabilities, or all kinds of stuff. But they usually also get fixed. There are also other SSL vendors, like for example, there's, I don't know, Bear TLS or different Bouncy Castle, or different implementations which implement the crypto and offer them as a convenient interface. But what you do need to protect your website is the knowledge to set this up correctly. So for example, when you set up OpenSSL, you need to choose which crypto systems you want to allow and which ones not, or which version of the certificate. And that's why I'm talking so much about, so that's why I'm mentioning so many three-letter acronyms here, for example, to give you a current up-to-date view of what secure choices are, or which key sizes you should select when you set up your certificate, for example. Thankfully, in many cases, there are some good defaults, like for example, CAs will typically recommend you some sensible options for what you choose, but you still need to know whether that's actually the case and be able to recognize, for example, whether using RSA with 1000-bit keys is a good idea or not. It's not. So choose a larger one, for example. Okay, and also when you verify, for example, a certificate, it helps if you can judge whether that's, for example, a sensible algorithm that you can trust or not. Okay, so that's it for certificates for the moment. There's one final remark that I want to add here before we jump on to the other protocols, and that's these elliptic curves that were mentioned a few times, and you will find that actually quite often. So what are elliptic curves and why didn't I explain them so far? So the short answer is, we talked about groups, right? So in DiffieHellman we said we have this group and we always used multiplication modulo p as a group. But there are other useful groups that you can use, but they are mathematically more complicated. And one of these alternatives is the elliptic curve group, where each individual element is not a single number, like in classical DiffieHellman, a number modulo p, but instead it's a point, which means it has two coordinates, an x coordinate and a y coordinate. So it's twice as large essentially. And with these points you can also do a sort of arithmetic. So they also have an operation and they can also be generators and generate other points. But the mathematical rules to implement them are a lot more complicated. That's why I'm not explaining them here. But they're still very relevant because you can sort of use them as a plug-in replacement for the modulo p arithmetic, wherever you would use that for an elliptic, for a discrete logarithm problem. So whenever you have a discrete logarithm problem, you can instead use the elliptic curve discrete logarithm problem, which is called EC-DLP, which looks exactly as before. So we also have these generators, except now they're generator points, and you also can generate all other points with them, except that now the operation isn't called multiplication, but we call it addition. But if you implement it, it actually looks a lot more complicated than just pure integer addition. So it's a more messy formula. But the kind of problem is the same, and you can use it for the same kind of things. So you can also do DiffieHellman using this magic addition instead of multiplication modulo a prime number. And for this reason, you will find many crypto systems with two variants. So for example, you find DiffieHellman, DH, and you find ECDH, which is the elliptic curve version of it. You will find DSA, which is a signature algorithm, and you will find ECDSA, which is kind of the same signature algorithm, but using this magic elliptic curve addition instead of multiplication. And the great thing is that the algorithms that I mentioned last week, the sub-exponential algorithms that normal DiffieHellman is vulnerable against, they don't work for elliptic curves. What this means is that the best algorithms that we have for breaking elliptic curve crypto systems are a lot slower. In other words, I can use smaller keys and achieve the same security level. So to give you an impression, you already know to some extent the first two columns of this. So here what I'm listing is if you want to achieve a particular security level measured in bits, like in particular the 128-bit security level that we're usually interested in, then you would need to choose these key sizes for either RSA encryption or signatures or DiffieHellman. For example, corresponding to 128-bit keys is approximately a 3000-bit modulus. So all the numbers would be 3000-bit numbers. If you want to have, for example, 256-bit security, you already need 15,000-bit numbers. So that's really huge. You don't want to have that running. It's very slow. And the great thing with the elliptic curve variants of exactly the same crypto system is that here the numbers can be a lot smaller. So for example, in elliptic curve, a 256-bit size, so it's exactly twice the security level, is sufficient to provide the same security as a 3000-bit normal DiffieHellman key. So you can imagine that even though the detailed formulas are a bit more complicated, the fact that you can work with much smaller numbers is still a big advantage, because all the computation formulas that you evaluate, even if they're a bit more complex, they're all on much smaller numbers and thus much faster. And additionally, it also means that all of the values are smaller, like the signatures are smaller and the public and private keys are smaller and so on. So you always also need to transmit less information. So that's the big advantage. And as far as we know, these provide more or less exactly the same security level. And this is why in many places you find these variants. Let's see at the question we have here. So the question is, let's make space. So the question is whether elliptic curves are functions with f of x and y structures. Well, I would say not exactly. Let's just see if it loads. It doesn't display, sorry. But let me get back to the previous picture to try and clarify that question. So yes, you always have x and y's, but the functions that you have, so each of these points here that you could be adding with this addition operation is a point with x and y coordinate. So you would write something like xy plus xy for p plus p. But you don't actually do a coordinate-wise multiplication, addition, but you have a more complicated formula with inverses and multiplications and all kinds of stuff inside it. But to keep it simple, we shall just write plus for it. So all of the operations take two halves. So that means if we say that we have a modulus which is 256 bits, it means that the size of a point is actually twice as large, because we need to store the x and the y coordinate. The good news is we can compress it usually, so it's actually twice as large, but that's all way too much detail to concern ourselves with. The short message is still x and y coordinate, and overall the values that you work with are still much smaller. And the way this addition is verified can be illustrated on a sort of curve. So not all combinations of x and y are actually valid in a discrete in an elliptic curve, but just x and y combinations that satisfy a particular formula. So this is maybe what you could mean with f of x and y. So there's one equation that they all need to satisfy to be valid. So normal Diffie-Hellman, the number just needs to satisfy that it's smaller than p. Here we have a more complicated formula, and you can actually draw a picture. So the red curve here denotes all the x and y coordinates in this real valued visualization that are valid on the curve. So in this picture here, every point that is on this red line would be a valid curve point. And the picture here tries to illustrate what the addition works like. So what you actually do to add 2 points is you draw a line through all of them, intersect it with the line at one more point, and mirror it. Let's not worry about why that always works, why there is always such a third point. We don't care here, but this is just to illustrate that you do a sort of geometric computation with your point. Of course, you encode it in formulas, but that's sort of the intuition behind the formulas. And that's the operation that you do. And that's why you always find such a picture when people try to implement elliptic curves, because the picture shows which points are valid points. Okay, and since we only have this nice curvy line here and don't draw the whole area of all x and y coordinates in red, that's why we can compress the points a bit and actually store them in less space. Anyways, back on topic. I see there was one more updated question here, so let's look at that. So elliptic curves are not functions in the mathematical sense. There is a function that defines which points are valid, but the curve isn't really a function that maps anything to anything. It's just an equation that says whether a point is valid. And the function comes into place as soon as you try to compute an addition. Okay. Great. If you're interested in more on that, there is one full lecture in the cryptography master course, which is called Discrete, Logarithm, and Elliptic Curves. There you can get a full explanation of how this works. But a warning ahead of time, it takes 1.5 hours to explain. That's why I don't explain it in detail here. Okay, so that's why you often see EC in algorithm names, because they're smaller. Okay, so that's now everything I wanted to say about TLS and comparable protocols. Now let's look at some different scenarios, for example, in privacy. So when you care about privacy enhancing technologies or protocols. Because the issue of what we've seen so far is TLS is great at protecting the confidentiality and authenticity of communication between two connection endpoints, client and a server. But often you want something more complicated. And one term for something more complicated that you could want, that you probably know about, is end-to-end encryption. What's the difference? Why is TLS not end-to-end encryption necessarily? Because TLS is really, it protects a transport layer between two devices. However, if you are not having a direct connection to whoever you're talking to, then this might not be sufficient. So consider a chat program. You want to chat with somebody, so you are the two endpoints that you want to have protection between, but you don't actually directly send each other messages, but instead you send messages to a server, and the server maybe sends them around internally in some cloud setup. For example, because when you send a message, Bob might not actually be online, so it needs to be stored somewhere until Bob comes online and it can be forwarded and so on. And you can use TLS to protect each of these individual connections between any two parties that are online at the same time. Because we saw in this handshake of TLS, you actually need to interactively talk to each other. So you need to be online at the same time. You don't have that in a chat setup. So when Alice is online, she can send messages, for example, to the WhatsApp or Signal server, but she cannot do a handshake with Bob directly. But you still want that the server can't actually read all of the stuff you're sending to Bob, generally. That's the idea of end-to-end encryption. So you need some way of setting up a secure channel between you and Bob without this interactivity that we have, where people need to be online at the same time. And one of the solutions to this approach is the so-called signal protocol that, as the name suggests, is used among others in the Signal setup, but it has since also been adopted in lots of others. So for example, WhatsApp actually also uses more or less the same protocol. There are some other differences between the two that make one of them the better choice, namely Signal, from a security and privacy perspective. So how does the Signal protocol work, and which additional challenges do we have in this setup? So the first challenge is that Signal doesn't actually just support one-to-one chats, but it also supports things like voice calls or group chats, where you have more complicated key setup or more stringent requirements on the speed of your encryption in the voice call case. And this manifests itself in a very long list of security properties. There are some security properties that we're already very familiar with, so we know confidentiality and integrity and authentication. That's all stuff that Signal provides. But in addition, it has lots of other stuff. So for example, it also provides forward secrecy and backward secrecy. So it's also called post-compromise security. So this sounds kind of familiar, but then there are lots of other things, like they offer participant consistency and destination validation and causality preservation and message unlinkability and blah, 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 blah. So lots of stuff that goes far beyond what we've seen so far. And actually the properties I've listed here are even only for direct one-to-one chats. I'm not even talking about group chats yet. There we have a full additional set of security properties. So you can imagine, I cannot explain to you the full protocol that does all of that, but I want to have a look at a few individual points that are relevant. So there's one question to the comment I gave regarding WhatsApp, and the question is whether you can actually verify that WhatsApp uses the Signal protocol. Well, you can to some extent, because you can, for example, sniff the packages and have a look at the packages and whether for example, the handshake process approximately matches what is specified. So this can be validated. But of course, you don't know in all detail because you can't actually look at the source code. So you don't know exactly, but it's plausible, I would say. There's another thing, and that is that the Signal protocol only protects part of the communication, but there are lots of other things that an app could do that can be threatening to the privacy that have nothing to do with this protocol. Like, for example, which rights it uses on your phone. Like, for example, does it want to read your contact book, your photos, your everything, or not? So, or how does it handle metadata? Does it store additional data on the server? And this is where there are big differences between WhatsApp and Signal. But I only want to focus on the protocol part for here, because that's enough of a topic actually. There is one other question, whether it's actually necessary that Signal uses all these protocols for sending messages. Well, if it wants to satisfy all of these security properties, then it needs to do all of the stuff that it does. So it's very well thought out generally. So let's have a look at some of the challenges. The first challenge is that you somehow want to authenticate each other, right? We saw how this works in TLS, but there it only worked because the endpoints were machines, so they could set up certificates and check each other's certificates. If you manually talk human to human, you need to authenticate as a human that you're talking to the right human. And one of the mechanisms how Signal allows you to do it is because it allows you to verify safety numbers. So what that is, or how you can do that, is if you are in a chat with somebody, you can choose to view their safety number, and the other person can do that as well. And you can check whether you see the same safety number. What is the safety number? Well, actually, it's simply a hash of both your public keys. So hashing it to make it much shorter and easier to compare. And if you verify that you're using the same one, then you see that no meet in the middle attack has happened, because you actually both are using the same public keys of each other, so you're in a common communication setup. If you want more details, technically here's a link how this works. So that's the replacement for certificates in this Signal setup. Whenever you want to check, you can just check the safety number. You will also see that safety numbers change occasionally. For example, if the user switches to a new device and thus gets a new private key. In that case, Signal will alert you that the safety number has changed, and you should or you can check again if you're unsure whether it's still valid. What's another challenge? Another challenge is that you still want to provide forward and backward secrecy like in TLS, but in TLS it was kind of sufficient to do this on a session by session basis. That's because you usually only talk very briefly to a website and exchange a lot of messages in that time, so that's a session. And within the session you don't actually have forward secrecy, but it's very short, so as soon as it's over, the forward secrecy kicks in. In Signal, you don't actually have this situation. So your session, so your one communication stream, your chat might actually last for years. So you talk to this person for years and just occasionally send a message. So you would really like to have this property, this forward secrecy, on a message by message basis. So whenever at some point, when you're sending one message, the private key gets compromised, for example, because your phone is stolen or something like that, it shouldn't be possible. Phone stolen is maybe a bad idea because your messages are stored there anyways, but okay, still, if that happens, if your private key is compromised, you shouldn't be able to decrypt all of the previous messages. So you somehow need a way to do something like ephemeral DiffieHellman, but after each message. And that's what is called the ratchet, or in the case of Signal, the double ratchet protocol. So what it does is, essentially, it does a little DiffieHellman in each message you send. And it actually doesn't just do a DiffieHellman, it also uses a key derivation function to always update the key in one direction in a way that can't be reversed. So you always can only go forward, but never backward, compute backward to the previous keys. And so what's a ratchet? This is a ratchet. So it's like a wheel that you can turn and step forward in one direction, but it can't go in the other direction. You will know this from some tools, which are also called ratchet, from different situations where you have cogwheels that are like one-sided. So this double ratchet is how to achieve this forward and backward secrecy. There is an additional specialty in how Signal uses the DiffieHellman protocol. Namely, it uses a so-called triple DiffieHellman. So it doesn't just do DiffieHellman with one key pair, but with three, because it's a mix of DiffieHellman and ephemeral DiffieHellman. And actually, both parties have a temporary and a long-term key. And you use DiffieHellman with each combination, so with one temporary and one long-term key, and one long-term and the other temporary key, and the two short-term keys, essentially. And the purposes of that is to get some form of repudiation, so that you can deny having sent certain things. Again, if you're interested in the details, I have a link at the end, at the top of the page, which is a write-up that gives an overview of secure messaging protocols in general and Signal specifically, and it also explains these terms in more detail, so what double ratchet means and how exactly this triple DiffieHellman works. Okay, so that's because of these long-lived sessions and because we want to have security message by message. One final challenge that I want to mention here: how do you contact new people when they are not online? So how do you send the first message to somebody? Because if we say here we're using DiffieHellman, this would always need some interaction. So how do we solve that? In particular, ephemeral DiffieHellman. Here we need these fresh ephemeral short-term keys. So how do we solve that? The way that Signal solves this is by using so-called pre-keys. What's a pre-key? So if Alice wants to be prepared to receive messages from anybody, from some new people while she's offline, she can pre-compute a few ephemeral DiffieHellman keys and give the public keys to the server. These are called pre-keys. Now somebody who wants to send something to Alice gets one of the pre-keys from the server, uses it for ephemeral DiffieHellman and sends it to Alice, and when Alice comes online she sees, oh, somebody has used this one ephemeral key, I use my ephemeral private key to decrypt it, and right afterwards I throw them away. So the pre-key on the server is invalidated, maybe I put a new one there, and I also throw away my private key to make it ephemeral. So these are pre-keys, and they are responsible for getting this asynchronicity into the protocol, being able to communicate even though one party is not online. Let's have a look at the questions that you have. So let's go back to an emptier slide and show them. So one person wants to be reminded what forward and backward secrecy are. In short, forward secrecy means when your private key is compromised at some point in time, all the previous messages shouldn't be compromised. So they shouldn't be able to read all your previous communication. And backward secrecy is the other thing. So the naming forward and backward might be a bit counterintuitive because the roles are sort of swapped, but I hope you can follow anyways. So backward secrecy or post-compromise security would mean if your key is compromised at some point, you can still recover from that somehow. So you can still agree on new and secure key materials, even if your key was stolen at one point. So this means a current key shouldn't allow to derive all future keys, but there always needs to be some fresh ephemeral DiffieHellman, for example, so that you can recover after your phone has been compromised or your key. So what's the next question? If a party like Facebook or Google refuses to work with an authority like the police, how do they anyway get the chat info or any other data referring to if the encryption and authenticity is so good? So this is a question of how the police can request chats even if they were actually protected. Well, if they were end-to-end protected, then the police can't. So for example, if you're using Signal to end-to-end protect your messages, then the police can't go to Signal and ask them to give the chats out because Signal doesn't have them, so they can't. However, what the police can do, and of course we've seen a lot in politics recently in Austria, is they can just walk up to you directly, take your phone, and just look at the chat log which is saved there. Because in Signal you can choose disappearing messages, those can't be recovered, but you can also just choose the regular chat mode where all the previous messages are still stored on your phone because you might want to read them at a later point. So that's still accessible if they're able to access Signal on your phone, which means you need to have the phone unlocked, and in case you have set up an access code to Signal, they need that access code. But they can simply ask you to give it to them. Okay, so that's how they can still get to chat protocols, but they need to get it at one of the endpoints where the information is still stored. They can't walk up to Signal, for example. Other services are not end-to-end encrypted. So for example, if you use Google Mail, this is not end-to-end encrypted unless you do that yourself. Only your encryption to Google is protected, and the connection between Google's mail server and the sender's mail server is encrypted, and the link between the sender and his server is encrypted. But Google actually stores the mails in plain text. Of course, they're going to protect it locally somehow, for example, on an encrypted drive or something, but they're still stored in Google's place, which also allows you convenient things like logging into webmail on a new device and still reading all your old mails. So if that's the case, then Google can, of course, actually hand out the information because it was not end-to-end encrypted. Server had access to it. Okay, and same with the Facebook and so on. So if I'm correctly informed, the Facebook Messenger actually also uses something similar to the Signal protocol. I'm not exactly sure on that one. But of course, the whole of Facebook is not end-to-end encrypted because they store a lot of the information that you can achieve whenever you enter the web service. So that's actually also an easy check for you. If you can log into some service on a new device and get your old information, then it wasn't end-to-end encrypted because the server is somehow able to give it to you. So they have the data. Okay, that's that. And I think it's actually high time for a break. So let's just rush through the last few topics of the protocols. One more question showed up. Let's look at that. So somebody is asking whether you can be sure that server-side they do not log chat metadata, as Signal server is not open source. That is correct. So it's not the issue that the protocol itself is not secure, but that a phone number is required. So somebody is pointing out here some limitations of Signal. You're right. So indeed, you need some things like a phone number, so you are sort of identifiable in there. And while Signal promises not to store any metadata, like for example, when you sent a message to which user or how long it was, this is a lot harder to verify because you can't validate exactly which software is running on their servers. However, depending on what companies do in certain situations, you can decide how much trust you want to give them. So for example, a company that collects all kinds of information that's not their business on your phone, like for example WhatsApp, which wants all kinds of has all kinds of requirements about which data it's allowed to read on your phone. That's maybe different compared to Signal, which has almost no requirements and also otherwise behaves in a way that is trustworthy. Then there's a question, how did Interpol hack the EncroChat servers? Sorry, I have absolutely no clue. I didn't follow that story. Okay, let's rush, as I said, and have a look at the at some additional challenges that we have in privacy. So let me just briefly mention the challenges, not the solutions. One of the challenges that we face sometimes is that we have a couple of parties who produce some data. For example, it could be households with smart meters and they have a certain power consumption at a given point in time. So there might be some peaks, like the first house has a peak here because they are washing their dishes and their clothes or something, and afterwards it's reused. And if somebody would be able to observe this behavior in a lot of detail, they could actually learn quite a bit about that user. For example, in the smart meter case, if you had access to the exact power measurements or power requirements that a household is using at the time, you can, for example, easily know, are they at home right now or are they on holiday? So is it a good opportunity to rob their house right now or not? If you have very fine-grained information, you can even learn other crazy things, like you can theoretically, if you have very detailed information about the power consumption, you can learn something like which TV channel are people watching right now, theoretically. So that's apparently sensitive information. But there are still some entities which need a bit of this information in order to work properly. For example, in the power system, there are some local gateways in some areas, and they need to know exactly how much area, how much power is consumed, or some other statistics in this particular area at any moment. So they need this information in a fine-grained way, but not like on a household per household basis. They just need to know the sum of it. But of course, they shouldn't just compute the sum locally based on the individual measurements, because that would mean they would need access to the individual measurements. So a challenge that we have here is you want to compute the sum of some values without knowing the individual values. That's one of the applications where cryptography and advanced cryptographic primitives like secure multi-party computation can help you solve that issue. Another example challenge is something that you might know yourself. So for example, let's say you're using a sort of new chat service, you're signing up to WhatsApp or something, and you want to know which of your friends are on WhatsApp. Now, you have a number of friends in your contact address book, and of course, the service, in this case, for example, WhatsApp, knows all of its users. And you want to know the intersection of these two sets. You want to know which of your contacts are also on the WhatsApp service, WhatsApp users, for example. However, you don't want to usually send your whole address book to WhatsApp. Maybe if you're using WhatsApp, you're doing it anyways, but you don't really want to. And on the other hand, WhatsApp doesn't want to send you a list of all of its users, of course, because that's very sensitive information. They can't just send you the names of billions of people. But you still want to know this intersection. And this challenge is called private set intersection. And it's also something that cryptography can help you solve. Not going into the details, let's have a look. Normally I would have planned the break now, but it seems a bit late for that. So let's maybe just do a short break of 5 minutes. So it's now 11:21. Let's continue working at 11:26 and have another half hour or so of content. That's actually also what one of the questions is about. So sorry for being so late with the break, but that's because we had a lot of questions in the first part. Okay, somebody's wondering about smart meters and whether they could have prevented getting one. Well, not really. So you can't really do much against getting one. It's actually also not as bad as it sounds. It can have some advantages for you. But still it allows you very detailed measurements that maybe you don't want everybody to have access to. Okay, so let's have this break and reconvene in 5 minutes. Enjoy a quick coffee and see you in a moment. Okay, there we are back from a very short break. In the meantime, we've gotten a visitor, but he's not entirely happy to be here, so he'll probably be right off again. So let's have a look at the second part of the lecture. In the meantime, there was a question whether I personally use WhatsApp. I don't think it's relevant here. So I do try to do as much as possible on Signal, but unfortunately it's really hard to keep contact with everybody with WhatsApp without WhatsApp. So yeah, that's that. Let's have a look at the slides again. So I would normally have prepared a short post-break recap, but I think we're going to skip that because we don't have that much time left. So let's instead jump right to cryptographic security and some issues related to that. So the first question that I want to discuss here is, where do keys come from? So we've been talking all the while a lot about public keys, private keys, secret keys, how big they need to be, and so on, but not so much about where they actually come from or what you need to pay attention to when generating them. In most cases, they are randomly generated. So that refers to both short-term keys, like during ephemeral DiffieHellman key exchange, but also for long-term keys. For example, if you generate a signing key, or if you set up two-factor authentication, there is usually a key established on your device, things like that. So you need some sort of randomness source, and it's absolutely crucial that this randomness source satisfies some quality criteria. These quality criteria can be best summarized under the somewhat unwieldy title Cryptographically Secure Random Number Generators, or C-Springs for short. Now, if you're using a normal laptop computer or desktop, there are usually several ways how you can get such securely generated random numbers. And two of the sources that you can use are, for example, the DevURandom device that you have on Linux systems, or you can also use the facilities of the OpenSSL library, for example. I've already mentioned this, that's a library for TLS that has all kinds of crypto services in addition that you can use. There are a number of things you shouldn't use. So in particular, there are a number of cheap random number generators, which are more efficient, which maybe also work on some constrained devices, but which don't offer the same guarantees. So some of the issues could be that they use input seeds that are of low quality. So for example, if you've ever tried to generate some random numbers for one of your programs, for example, because you're implementing a randomized algorithm or because you need to generate random test cases or something, you might have done something like using a simple randomness function that whatever your programming language offers, like a random device or something in C++, and you might have seeded it with a starting value like the current time in milliseconds or something like that. Now, that's okay if you just need like a bit of randomness for something like randomizing an algorithm, but it's absolutely not sufficient if you want to generate cryptographic keys. You can't just generate a cryptographic key by taking the current time of day as a basis. I mean, the time of day when the key was generated will be, for example, written down in your certificate, so you can't use that as a key. It's not secret. There are also some issues with random number generators that don't provide the necessary guarantees. So for example, in an insecure random number generator, it might be the case if you learn some parts of the randomness stream, you might be able to predict future outputs or recover past outputs of the randomness generator. That would be a big issue because it would mean if you know some of the randomness, like for example the randomness exchanged in the beginning of the TLS protocol, you could then learn secrets about learn something about secrets that were generated later, like right after the randomness in TLS, you generate the very sensitive ephemeral Divi keys. If they are generated from the same device, and it allows you to compute forward or backward, that's a huge problem. This is actually something that has happened in practice. So some of these update functions that you shouldn't use for crypto purposes are, for example, the Mersenne twister, which is otherwise nice, has good statistical properties, but it just isn't secure against adversaries who do things like trying computing backward and forward. So these are some criteria, but how do you actually get numbers which satisfy these criteria? Well, there are generally two ingredients that you can use, and you usually should use both. The first is what we call non-deterministic, a hardware source typically. So this is often called a hardware random number generator or true random number generator. So what's that? It's a hardware device that you have specifically for generating random numbers. So of course it needs some input noise. A very classical example would be something like a Geiger counter or something which measures an unpredictable physical process and tries to translate that into bits. You can also do things like you can set up small circuits that have a non-deterministic behavior, for example, because you have a race condition in the circuit or something like that. So you can use this as a basic source of randomness, and your laptops or so usually have some such devices inbuilt which can measure something. So here you try to use an external process and map that into bits. The downside is this is usually really slow and has a very small output rate, so you can't get a lot of randomness at once. And for this reason, you usually use something in addition. So one reason is it's relatively slow, and the other reason is if you have such a measurement device, it might not really satisfy statistical criteria. So for example, you might have a very nice and unpredictable stream of bits that you generate, but it might be biased. It might have more zeros than ones, for example. So this is also something you need to compensate for. And for this, you can use deterministic pseudo-randomness. Now, if I say deterministic randomness, that really sounds completely contradictory, and in a way it is, but it's still something we use a lot. So what's a pseudo-random number generator, or PRNG for short? Sometimes also called a deterministic random bit generator. So here you have the words right next to each other, a DRBG. So that's an algorithm to generate a sequence of numbers with very nice statistical properties based from a seed. So what's the idea? What do you usually use? You typically seed your DRBG with some secure true random number as a seed, so that it has this unpredictability. You might also reseed it occasionally, but then to blow it up into a large number of bits with nice statistical properties, you actually use such a deterministic random bit generator. And for the second part here, you can use crypto. So for example, we've actually seen already a system that does that expands a short string into a long string in a secure way. One of the ways we saw how to do that was the counter mode of operation. If you remember, this was an encryption mode which generated a key stream from a short key by simply encrypting an increasing counter using this key and the nonce. And each ciphertext block would then be used as a block of randomness. And if you know all the output blocks, you still cannot compute back to the seed, and you also can't predict future or previous outputs. So that's an example of a cryptographic ingredient that you can use. But there are also more a variety of other schemes that use different mathematical ways of achieving these properties. So usually you want to mix the two. And usually if you use a secure device, like for example Divi Random, then you actually get this mix of a secure random seed and some post-processing and a pseudo-random number generator to make sure that any deficiencies of this one here, like a bias in the bits, are compensated, while at the same time using the advantages of this purely random seed. So that's one way how to get keys. Another way how to get keys is that in some cases they're actually derived from another secret, like a password or like a like for example, the values that you exchange in a DiffieHellman key exchange. So you need a way of deriving keys from other values. And this way, or this kind of function, is called a KDF, key derivation function. So there's a specific type that we've already met in the first lecture that's called PBKDF. That's a password-based key derivation function. So you put in a password, then you typically have a very slow function that's intentionally slow, and at the end, a small symmetric key falls out. So it's a bit similar to the post-processing that we saw on the previous slide. So you take a random seed as an input, but maybe of lower quality, which has some deficiencies, and then you process it to get something that you actually want to use. But of course, in that case, it still depends on the entropy of the password, how secure it is. So if you have an easy to guess password, anybody could use the key derivation function, plug in your password, and try the resulting keys. So it still depends on the quality of the password. One application example where this is used is if you look at disk encryption. So here I've posted the output of some information about my own hard disk encryption, and you can see there, we've already seen this in one of the previous lectures, I think. You see here that my hard disk is encrypted using some symmetric encryption scheme, AES-XTS, but that the key for this is derived from my password with a password-based key derivation scheme. Okay, I see here a number of detailed discussion points that I'm afraid I can't answer in detail, like why specific functions are not recommended. I'm sorry, you'll have to look that up. There are also some other suggestions, like taking some particular counters modulo a large number. The general advice is please don't try to do this stuff yourself, but use a proven way of achieving it. So in particular, if you take the current CPU timestamp and compute modulo a large number, like suggested in this task here, you have two issues. First, where do you take this large number from, and how is it random? So it seems like you have a sort of recursive problem there. And the second issue is that taking a number modulo another number does not give you uniformly distributed numbers. So some bits have a bias. So for example, if you compute numbers modulo 1500 or so, then the most significant bit is more likely to be 0 than to be 1, stuff like that. So you have biases in that. So a simple modulo operator is usually, for cryptographic purposes, not a good idea to generate random numbers. There are advanced protocols to generate specific types of random numbers. Like sometimes you need a random variable that follows a normal distribution, or that is in a very particular range or so. And it's very difficult to actually write functions that give you this behavior without any biases. So please use something that has previously defined, and don't cook up your own stuff, or read up on it if you want to know if some specific method is secure. Okay, so that's a short comment on keys. There's one other topic I wanted to graze briefly, and that's an additional thread. Since we're talking about entropy and bits here, it's also a good time to talk about quantum computing for a short moment. So what's the basic thing with quantum computing? What's the main difference to a normal computer? In a normal computer, your unit of data is bits. A bit can have one of two states. It can be 0 or 1. In a quantum computer, you have so-called qubits. Now, a qubit doesn't have a definitive state, 0 or 1. It is in a so-called superposition of states. And you only get to know the value once you measure the system. So measuring means fixing it to one of the two values. You probably know the famous cat example related to this issue. So as long as you don't measure, it's in a superposition. And one of the things that makes this powerful is that you can then do computations on a bigger string of qubits, for example. And all the while, this string of qubits can be in a superposition of many, many states. For example, if you have 49 qubits, then together, if they are linked together, they could be together in a superposition of 2 to the 49 possible states. if you would spell that out and write down each individual of these possible states, you would use something like more than 3 petabytes. So it's a lot of different states. And the system can be in a superposition. And the way this can be useful is you can try to write algorithms such that the system is in a superposition of many possible states, like in simplified manner of speaking, for example, many possible keys. And the most likely one is the one with the highest probability to be observed when you measure. So this is what you usually try when you use quantum computers for cryptography, for cryptanalysis, that you want to write an algorithm such that the most likely in this superposition of states when measuring is the correct solution. There are a few quantum computers already right now that are somewhere in this area. That's why I've picked the example with the size of 49. However, they still have a lot of issues. So it's very difficult to keep these states stable. It's very difficult to have sufficiently many linked qubits. There are very many issues that have prevented quantum computers from doing any serious damage so far. But if they would be stable enough, so could do computations sufficiently long and would be sufficiently well linked to each other, then we would have a big problem in cryptography, because of the 3 ingredients we've always talked about today. So the signatures and key exchange in the handshake for authenticity and exchanging keys, plus then the actual encryption. Out of these 3 ingredients, 2 could be more or less completely broken with strong quantum computers. So you will notice these are the 2 asymmetric parts. So they are the threat. Symmetric cryptography, not so much. Why is that? Well, that's because we have 2 main algorithms that are relevant for cryptography that we know for quantum computers. One of them is the very famous Shor algorithm by Peter Shor. And this algorithm actually manages to solve some hard problems in polynomial time. On a normal computer, this requires super polynomial time, so a lot longer. And the 2 most important examples of this are the integer factorization and all the variants of the discrete logarithm problem, including the elliptic curve discrete logarithm problem. So all the signature schemes and key exchange schemes that I've discussed so far would be vulnerable to this algorithm. However, currently we are not capable of building sufficiently strong and stable quantum computers. So far, to the best of my knowledge, the largest number that was factored with actual implementations of this Shor algorithm is 21. Now, that's not very impressive. And actually, even for that, you need a lot of effort to get that working. Okay, so no need to worry right now, but this should be on your mental landscape. So probably by the time you've been working in your job for 20 years, the situation looks a bit different. That's why I'm talking about it now. So this Shor algorithm is complicated for asymmetric cryptography, but we also have an algorithm that's relevant for symmetric cryptography. Only the damage it does is by far not as bad. So in the asymmetric case, we essentially reduced an almost exponential runtime, almost, to something polynomial. That's a huge difference. In symmetric cryptography, we only have the Grover algorithm, which is clever in its own right and does give a speed up, but the speed up is only sort of in a similar complexity class. So it reduces the complexity of O of n, where n is a very large number, to O of square root of n. You can also think of it in terms of the size of the input. So if you have an n-bit input and the original runtime is O of 2 to the n, then the Grover algorithm will need something like 2 to the n half, which is the same as square root of 2 to the n. So it would halve the bit size of the security level. For example, if you have some n-bit values like n-bit keys, then Grover can search for them and give the correct one in square root of n time. So if you use a 256-bit key, you still get 128-bit security out of it, even under quantum computers in the symmetric world. So that's why we're not that worried about it in the symmetric crypto, because if it really comes to that, if we really get powerful quantum computers, well, we just use AES 256 instead of AES 128. We already have the solution to that. It's not much more expensive. So it's like a simple band-aid, whereas this is really fatal for asymmetric cryptography. To fix this situation, there's currently a competition ongoing by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, in the US, who are trying to find successor schemes to RSA signatures and DiffieHellman and so on. This has been going on for several years now. So NIST asked for submissions in 2016, and the actual candidates were announced in 2017. So the competitors in this competition, which were a large number of schemes designed by international teams of cryptographers. And by now we are in round 3, so they have been narrowed down significantly. And we now have a set of round 3 candidates, plus some so-called alternate candidates in case the main candidates turn out to not be so great. And one of them is probably going to be standardized sometime in the near future. Let's see, maybe sometime next year or so they can finally agree on something. There's currently a number of different issues that are discussed there. So the goal is to replace both secure signature schemes and public key encryption schemes with something that's post-quantum secure. So post-quantum means, or post-quantum cryptography means finding crypto schemes that are still secure even if the attacker has a strong quantum computer. So the idea is that we use public key encryption for key agreement. So instead of DiffieHellman or RSA encryption, we would use that, or a key agreement scheme. And instead of the, for example, RSA signatures or DSA signatures, we would use a post-quantum secure signature scheme. And what these candidates all try to do is they try to leverage some other mathematical problems, not factoring and not the discrete log problem, because Shor breaks them. But there are a couple of other hard problems that we don't have any solutions for, any quantum algorithms. We can't really prove that there are no such algorithms, but we don't know one yet. And some of these areas that we use here are so-called coding theory, lattices, which is another mathematical object, or also constructions that are based on symmetric primitives, because we saw that symmetric crypto doesn't suffer as much. So people have tried to use ingredients from symmetric crypto to build something asymmetric, and hash trees are an example for that and can be used for signatures. Okay, so that's currently in the process. Let's hope we know more in a year or so. There is one more question of understanding about qubits. So it means it can be 0, 1 and 1, 0 at the same time. Well, yes, essentially. So it's usually written down as a sort of vector that states the probabilities of each individual value that it can have. Like it's 70% a 1 and 30% a 0 or something like that. And once you measure, we say that the state of the qubit collapses to an actual specific value, so 0 or 1. And we want it to collapse to the most likely value, and we hope that the most likely value, based on how we set up our algorithm, is for example, the key we're looking for. But again, if you're more interested in that, there's a dedicated unit for post-quantum cryptography and quantum cryptanalysis in the cryptography course. And it goes by exactly that name. So you can also look up the video online if you like. Notice that we're always talking about post-quantum cryptography here. And that's something very, very, very different from what some people call quantum cryptography. Quantum cryptography means trying to use quantum computers for communication. So in post-quantum cryptography, we assume the attacker has a quantum computer. Some people, in particular physicists, are researching quantum cryptography where they assume that Alice and Bob each have a quantum computer and can use a quantum channel to communicate, which theoretically has some nice properties, but in practice has real issues, and it's also not so realistic for the near future because we just can't afford to all have a quantum computer at home. So post-quantum cryptography is the much more urgent question because it's going to be much sooner that the attacker has a quantum computer rather than all internet users have a quantum computer. Okay. Yeah. So that's all I wanted to say about the quantum scenario. Let's now have a final look at some issues that can happen when implementing cryptography. So it seems like the setup here and my phone are disagreeing on whether there are more questions. There is one more question on the RNG part, so on the previous part, whether keyboard and mouse input are used for seeding PRNGs. Yes, they are. So if you generate your own private key, then one additional input that it uses is the movement of your mouse, because that's also rather difficult to predict precisely. Okay, so enough with that part. Let's look at what can go wrong when doing cryptography, when using it, when implementing it, and so on. So what I have here is a table that is provided by Vera code. If you're more interested in that and explanations, have a look at the link on top. So here, what they did at Vera code is they analyzed the most common vulnerabilities in implementations by different languages, not limited to crypto, but general IT security problems. So you will see, for example, unsurprisingly, if you look at implementations in C and C++, one of the big issues there is buffer management. So out of bounds errors, something like that, which we'll also hear more about in the system security part. There are also many issues related to error handling that is done incorrectly. If we look at other languages, you see that in some cases, cryptographic problems are more of an issue. For example, in the Python programs they analyzed, there wasn't much of this memory stuff, because Python has a different approach to organizing memory, but you will suddenly find quite a number of cryptographic issues. So why is that so different between languages? First, of course, it's clear that the security features of a language, like how it, for example, treats buffers and memory and variables, will have an influence on how likely those values are. But the choice of a language also sort of influences the choice, for example, of the cryptographic libraries that you use. And it depends a lot on those libraries, how often you will see cryptographic issues. The issues might either be inside the library, if this is flawed, but much more often, it's that a library doesn't have clear user guidance, clear documentation. For example, in the documentation, there might be some simple example that demonstrate the use, and this example might be, for example, cryptographically insecure because they want a very simple example, so they don't explain some of the things you should do. And then everybody copies that code and has the same problem. There are also things like insecure default values. For example, if we look at PHP, which you see is very red in this column here, one of the issues in PHP is that there are some widely used functions with very simple names. For example, there's a crypt function. But these functions have insecure default choices. So by default, they, for example, choose an inappropriate or insecure cipher. So that's why in some languages you have much more cryptographic issues than in others. It depends on the existing library infrastructure. So instead of asking you what common crypto failures are, I now have just listed some examples that we can briefly have a look at now. So what are two broad categories of crypto failures? Well, one is using no crypto at all or insufficient crypto, and another very widely spread mistake is using obsolete crypto. So as an example for the first case, a use of insufficient cryptography would be, for example, you use a symmetric encryption scheme, but you don't authenticate. So you don't do a MAC afterwards. You don't use authenticated encryption. In that case, while nobody can read your transmitted messages, they might be able to manipulate it. One of the implementations that was affected by this is, for example, the VMware view feature, where you could manipulate the transmitted data. An example for using obsolete crypto is if you use either algorithms, old algorithms that are known now to be insecure, like the insecure MD5 hash, the insecure RC4 stream cipher, the obsolete DES block cipher, or also insufficient key sizes for a generally secure scheme. So RSA is generally fine, but not if you use keys that are only 512 bits large. You should use at least 3000 bits. And this is the kind of error that often turns up when you have insecure defaults in a particular language, or when you have very old documentation which still lists very outdated example algorithms. It can also happen to you, even if you use a new implementation, if you have an attacker who tries to downgrade you. So for example, when you set up TLS communication, you always have to choose one of several cipher suits. And what an attacker can do is they try to downgrade you to an insecure cipher suit, an insecure choice of variants. Like you offer many options to the server, but an attacker intercepts your message, throws the secure options all away, and keeps only the insecure options, something like that. If you're interested in an example of this kind of attack, try to Google the drown attack. There was also, for example, a malware, very, very advanced and clever malware, that used the fact that many certification authorities still used the outdated MD5 hashing scheme as basis for their signing, and they were able to get rogue CA certificates based on that. So they were able to prepare two certificates, one that looked legit, that they got signed, and another one that had the same hash value. So a hash collision. MD5 allows it because it's insecure. And so they got a certificate for a signature from the CA for the one certificate, but then they exchanged it with the other certificate with the same hash, but still had the valid signature from the CA. So now it looked like they had a valid certificate and could even issue new certificates, which they did, and they exploited this in this Flame malware setup. Some other things that can go wrong. Something that I've mentioned a few times is when people try to come up with their own homebrew protocols for their very specific applications without really knowing much about other protocols and without using any existing well thought out protocols. So for example, they might know, okay, I've heard this crypto course, now I know everything about textbook RSA, and I know what the AES does, and I just plug that together. If you do that, you might end up with things like deterministic RSA, where you can easily verify whether a ciphertext belongs to a particular plaintext. If you only learn about AES, but you don't learn how to use it, you might come up with the most logical thing and, for example, use AES in the ECB mode, which we have seen to be completely insecure. That's the Tux picture, if you remember. You might even come up with your own homebrew ciphers. And unfortunately, this also happens quite a lot. So in particular, the homebrew ciphers are very widespread when we look at systems like car key systems, because for some reason, car vendors are really fond of buying proprietary crypto from some shady vendors, and this often doesn't work out as expected. Another case where you actually see this is some apps. So for example, Telegram, while it sometimes advertises as a secure messenger, actually has a pretty bad track record of trying to come up with their own protocols and ciphers, which don't really hold up to modern standards. Okay, so this can happen even with relatively knowledgeable people. It can still go wrong. So whenever possible, please use something existing and proven. So for example, when of course, if you're setting up a website, you're just going to use TLS and use an existing implementation like OpenSSL. But what if you're, for example, a startup selling some IoT devices? Try to use existing protocols exactly for this purpose. So TLS might be a bit too expensive, but maybe it does actually run on your system. To, for example, do the connection between the devices you sell and the server that tells them something. Or if it doesn't work, try to find something more lightweight, but an existing algorithm and an existing implementation if possible, so that you can also read up on its properties. In some cases, people also do bad crypto intentionally, so they build a backdoor into it. There's one very, very infamous example of that, And that's this, if you remember the acronym, we just had that. This is a randomness generator, so a deterministic random bit generator, and it's one that was actually standardized by NIST at the request of the NSA. And this bit generator had the property that it used two very, very specific numbers to run. And the person who generated the numbers had some extra secret knowledge that they could use to predict the future outputs. And the NSA pushed that this was actually deployed relatively widely, for example, in the BSafe tool from the RSA company, or also in this particular firmware, the ScreenOS firmware. So they used this randomness generator, and for the person who planted the backdoor, so who generated the two specific numbers, they could actually predict future outputs from seeing the first few outputs. And could exploit that, for example, to predict the key by just knowing the nonce that was generated right beforehand. So that's a big issue. Fortunately, this case is not that frequent to the best of our knowledge, and people also usually notice this in advance. So this is a big advantage of the Kerckhoff principle of publishing crypto and reasoning why you're using this crypto. So for example, in this case of dually CDRBG, cryptographic researchers have said from the very, very beginning that this could be susceptible to a backdoor. People just didn't listen for some reason. But it's not like this went completely unnoticed for a long time. It was already known relatively soon that this is a potential limitation. What are other failures? Improper key management is very often the case, like having your secret key in too many places, or having the secret key hard-coded somewhere where people can read it. For example, some people often accidentally upload either their private keys or their passwords from some service when they publish, for example, their code on GitHub. Because as part of the code, somewhere there's this file with the secret key, and they just push it together with everything else. Storing stuff insecurely is also a big source of issues, in particular when it's about password. We already learned how to do this properly, but unfortunately, many web servers are still incapable of storing passwords properly, which means hashed with a password hashing function together with a salt. Okay, nonce misuse is an example that also often happens. So that means reusing a number that should only be used once. You see several examples for that, as far as I'm aware, in your exercises at the moment. But they've also happened in the real world, including on the PlayStation 3 and on some external hard drives. And finally, something else we've talked about today already, insufficient randomness. So these two issues are very often linked together. And of course, this unfortunately also happens very often in the real world. You will maybe also see some examples of this in the application security part. For example, this is also something that, for example, happens with the pre-installed passwords on certain routers. Okay, so that's it. Everything that I wanted to cover. Sorry for the rush at the end. So let's have a quick conclusion about what I tried to talk about today. What I'm trying to convince you is that current applications that are done well can build on very well understood cryptography. So they use secure standards. Standards is an important word here. And they use the up-to-date versions of this. And we have really a great toolset of great crypto that won't break anytime soon. These kinds of things are usually efficiently implemented. They are readily available. So please use them. In that case, you can be pretty sure that cryptography won't be the weakest part of your system. Of course, there can be all kinds of other things that go wrong, but it won't be the crypto part. And while we have some very well-established and well-working ingredients, there is still an immense amount of research going on in cryptography. And some of the directions that are currently researched a lot include privacy-preserving technologies, like the examples I mentioned, which often require much more advanced and complicated crypto systems than we saw in this course. And another topic is long-term security for a very long term. And one of the biggest issues there is the threat of quantum computers. But we also do all kinds of other research on implementing crypto security, on making it more efficient, on making it more useful for specific scenarios, and so on and so on. Okay, so that's everything from my side on cryptography. I'll later have another look at the questions. I see there is one in the meantime. I want to mention that at the end of the slides, I've attached some examples of what exam questions for this course have looked like in the past. So let's briefly look at one or two to give you an impression of what kind of questions we ask. So I already mentioned that the security properties something offers are something that's really important to me. So one question that I've asked in the past is, for example, name 2 security properties that we care about in information security. That could be, for example, confidentiality and authenticity. And then name crypto systems which satisfy or don't satisfy this security property. So either they offer confidentiality or not. So for example, something that doesn't offer confidentiality would be a signature. Something that does protect it would be an encryption scheme. I'm also sometimes asking some details about one of the algorithms we covered in detail, but I usually provide some guidance. So this is an example of what I've asked about DiffieHellman in the past. So I've given some basic starting points, and then I'm asking you to fill in what are the steps that are completed. Like Alice chooses a private key and computes the generator to the power of the private key and sends this to Bob. Something like that. Where I don't care if you use exactly the right notation, but it should be clear to me that you understand what sort of values they generate in exchange, like public keys, private keys, and what do they have to do with these parameters. I'm also often asking or giving examples of some secure or insecure use that we saw in the course. So for example, I give this encryption mode, which you might recognize as the electronic codebook mode, and ask why it's secure or insecure. So you see, sometimes you just need to fill in a few words, sometimes you need to write an explanation, and I also usually include some checkbox only answers, which are very similar to what we've seen in the quiz at the beginning of the course. So you might actually recognize some of these questions. So these are sometimes also multiple choice. Like for example, tick all of the following schemes which provide message authentication. Like for example, encryption doesn't, but MEPs do, signatures do as well, and authenticate encryption also provides message authentication. Something like that. You can have a look at those questions in more peace based on the slides that are going to be online. So now let's have a look at the one question that has appeared in the meantime. So it's more of a comment about the secure programming languages, and they are assuming that Rust would probably rank better in this analysis, while it would certainly avoid certain kinds of mistakes that show up very often in other languages. There are a lot of libraries available for crypto algorithms in Rust, yes. I haven't personally used them because I don't usually write in Rust, because I don't usually write secure applications. I prefer breaking them. But I know that there are Rust crates, for example, for different authenticated encryption schemes, for different signature encryption schemes. So if you just Google for them, you will easily find them. I know there are even Rust implementations, for example, of our own design, the Ascon authenticated encryption scheme. Okay, then another comment which I really appreciate. So somebody found the lecture interesting. I'm very happy to hear that. Okay, let's wait for a couple more seconds if anything else turns up. Otherwise, it's really a pleasure to have worked with you, at least remotely. Unfortunately, I never got to see any of you, but that is going to change during the exam. Okay, there is one more question about how I do things, so how I do online transactions. Well, it depends on what the shops support. PayPal is an example of a scheme that does have some limitations, so basing all of your security on the email address and a probably insecure password doesn't seem like a great choice for me, but it also offers some safety guarantees in case things go wrong because of these weaknesses. Actually, many money transaction systems really have their flaws. I also don't see how the basic credit card system has held on so long if you only need to know the stuff that's printed on the card to do any sort of transaction. So in many cases, it's really a wonder that things work, but for some reason they do. Because there are a lot of fail-safes to recover in case something goes wrong. Like in case of credit cards, things often go wrong. There are often invalid transactions, fraudulent transactions, but the credit card companies just have a mechanism to compensate. So for example, they block this endpoint in the future, they block your number and you need to unlock it again. You can get a new card. They have certain insurance mechanisms, but of course you also always pay for this, for example, by paying your credit card fees, which are relatively high. So that's maybe also an important message. Most systems have some flaws, so it's important to always have a recovery mechanism to compensate that. Somebody's asking about the PETS lecture, which is a master course that covers many of these privacy-enhancing technologies, including blockchain, which, sorry, I didn't really have time for today. I think with this course, you're quite well prepared. It might make sense to do the cryptography course at the same time or before the PETS lecture, because I think you will be able to use many of the stuff you hear there for PETS, but I think it should be feasible anyways. Okay, some more praise, that's really nice of you. Okay, and yeah, making slides is something I enjoy a lot, so I am happy that you like them too. Okay, I guess that's it. We are already over time. Oh no, that's not it. So somebody is talking more about credit cards and debit cards, because there are only so few options for cracking the PIN. That's another example for a case where there is a flaw in the system, like there are only 9999 possible combinations for your 4-digit PIN. However, they also have a mechanism to compensate, because you need to do all of these tries online. So every one of these tries actually needs to be forwarded to the bank or verified by your card, depending on the details. And here you can simply choose to do something like you simply block this online access after 3 incorrect tries or something. So that's also a mechanism that works in some cases. Like an interactive system, you can simply block users or block users for a certain period of time if they have many bad accesses. But in other cases, that's not possible. Like if somebody has access to your encrypted hard drive, they can guess the key at any rate that their hardware allows. They can't be interrupted from that because there is no online access needed. So it always depends on the scenario, how big is big enough, what amount of entropy you need, and whether you can maybe compensate for a lower entropy with some additional mechanism. Okay, thanks a lot. I guess that was finally the last question. So thanks a lot for tuning in, and all the best for the exercises and the exam. Okay, one final question that I can't resist to answer. What's my preferred way to make a master password that you use for the password manager? So what I personally did is I tried to get really real entropy, and I didn't want to trust my computer to do it, so I used what is called diceware. That's a way of rolling dice to generate actual physical entropy and then putting your password together based on that. For example, based on a word list where the dice roll decides which word to use. That's something I've used at some point in the past. I found it fun to do. I found the password easy to remember, even though it's quite a bit to type in. So that's one thing you could do. Also, the strategy of taking sentences or a paragraph and using the first letters in that is, I think, a reasonable approach in practice. But in any case, really make sure that you do remember it, because if you lose it, all your passwords are gone. So it might make sense to also give yourself a sort of backup mechanism to this. Like, for example, keep a copy of the password database secured with a different password. That's one way of doing it. Okay, so thanks a lot for the interaction and the great questions. I really enjoyed it. And I hope you have interesting afternoon in the exercises. So, bye. Oh, it looks like it's going to be difficult to stop the screen because my laptop actually died in the meantime, so you will see a blank screen for a moment before we are actually gone. Bye.